Thanks to Kent and CEI for having me here. I will try to talk for 3 to 4 minutes. I've never done it successfully before, but I'll try this time. I thought that I would make a couple of comments quickly on the one hand, some of the perhaps underappreciated consequences of the open internet order on the very businesses it is purported to be intended to protect, and then maybe make a few comments on some of the debate that's been going on right now about the effects on broadband investment. So on the business model point, the big issue turns on the consequences of a ban on paid prioritization. The stated objective here is largely this idea that in the absence of neutral flow of bits, that new entrants, startups will have to pay this toll in order to get onto the internet, that they'll be disadvantaged relative to their wealthier or more established competitors. In the span of the 10 seconds I have to talk about this, let me say, actually, the precise opposite is more likely to be the case. And it really surprises me how often you see representatives or purported representatives of a sort of startup community advocating in favor of a ban on paid prioritization when these are companies that by definition are languishing in obscurity relative to established competitors and who could presumably benefit from the ability to buy into some form of prioritization that might give them some leg up in the cutthroat competition against their established competitors. It's not that fast lanes of any sort or zero rating or sponsored data or anything else are the only ways of doing this, but it's certainly one of them. And there's certainly a very clear pro-competitive rationale for it, pro-consumer rationale for it, and therefore no justification that I can see for a presumptive or conclusive ban on that kind of practice. It's conceivable there could be a problem with that kind of practice, but that's obviously well suited to an ex post, case-by-case sort of analysis, certainly the kind of thing the antitrust authorities are accustomed to doing, and even if you had a situation that antitrust couldn't reach, some sort of case-by-case adjudication at the FCC would be more appropriate. There's a lot more to that, and I'm happy to talk about it more, but the core point there is the main, or one of the most important, if not the central, justifications for the set of rules that were adopted in the OIO are, I think, if not entirely backwards, certainly extremely problematic. Yeah.
That framework was in place for some time.
Well, you could say that it worked. I mean, in the sense that it certainly the structure was available. There were a couple of privacy-related actions taken. I can't remember that there were any, sort of paid prioritization actions taken. But then again, I can't recall that there were any paid prioritization or net neutrality violations, which, by the way, is another important part of this. If we're talking about these kind of very strong and very invasive per se ex-ante rules, you would expect to have a pretty clear indication that there is a problem. And most people would agree that there's somewhere between 3 and 5 examples of conduct in the entire history of the internet, including the unpronounceable number of bits that have transmitted across it, that might possibly rise to that level. And so in that sense, assuming that is representative, assuming that's not a function of the fact that nobody noticed the massive violations that were going on, I would think that some sort of case-by-case sort of adjudicatory process would be more than sufficient. But I also think, again, that the antitrust authorities are more than capable of accomplishing that. And I also think there's not a lot of incentive for it to happen in the first place. To the extent that it does happen through something like zero rating or sponsored data, there are some people who think that's inherently a bad thing. And maybe we can have a discussion about that. But most of us, I think, understand why that's actually a really good thing. And far from being something that needs to be adjudicated, is actually something that we should be supporting and promoting. So I think that's, can I make 2 comments on the investment issue? That's fine. Oh, that's fine. I'm sure I've gone over 4 minutes. So, so as you may know, there's been a pretty big debate. Ajit has suggested that there's evidence that the imposition of Title II has reduced broadband investment. Again, you'll recall one of the justifications for the open internet order was the, as one judge called it, the triple cushion shot, the virtuous circle. I won't go into explaining it because no one really can explain it. But the idea ultimately was that there would be more broadband investment, not less. And so it's perfectly sensible to look at what's happened with broadband investment in order to sort of make some sort of assessment of whether the open internet order actually accomplished what it set out to accomplish. And what I'll say about all of that is the vast majority, in fact, with one exception, all of the analyses that I have seen on this issue are crap. And what I mean by that is that they are not statistically valid analyses, that you cannot just look at the number of amounts invested before the open internet order and the amounts invested afterward, you know, looking at the Yahoo Finance page and say, hey, see, they've gone down. That just doesn't tell you anything. George Ford has done what I consider to be the only really solid analysis here. And we don't have a lot of data, we don't have a lot of time, so even it has to be taken with a little bit of a grain of salt. But, excuse me. But if you look at what's happened following the imposition of the open internet order, compared to the best guess of a baseline of a but-for world, what would have happened without the open internet order, he finds a 20 to 30% annual drop, or 20 to 30 or 30 to 40, let's call it 30% drop off in the rate of investment by broadband providers in their networks. And concludes, for very good reasons, because his analysis is actually really well done, that it can pretty much only be attributed to the imposition of the net neutrality order, of Title II, the open internet order. Everyone else's analysis should be thrown in the trash. I shouldn't say everyone else's. A couple of them are bad analyses, but then they do back of the envelope sort of comparisons to say, I know this is a bad analysis. This is not, would never get into an economics journal. But looking at all of the variables that we can look at casually, it sort of looks like this is the only possible explanation. That's sort of how I would describe Hal Singer's analysis, which again doesn't do the right kind of but-for comparison. But he does have a pretty compelling claim that the kind of drop-off he's seen is really unexpected, and he can't come up with any other explanation as to what would have caused it. That may not, again, be sufficient to sort of hold up in court or an economics journal. It's certainly not as good as George's, but it corroborates George's, and by the way, comes up with, I believe, almost exactly the same number. Lots more to say on that, but I'll stop there.
Let's move down the table.
Thank you, Kent, and nice to be here. So, I'll set my stopwatch.
I would have ignored it anyway, but I could have said it.
So my take on this is that this Title II fight is not about net neutrality. I consider net neutrality a distraction in many ways, and I'll explain why that is. So, the real fight and why there's fireworks, as the chairman said, is that this is about whether the FCC can reinvent itself as an internet regulator. That's what the fight is about. That's why it's contentious. And net neutrality is just kind of a frosting to make it palatable. We've talked about net neutrality for years, and there's very little consensus on what it means. You can find a dozen different definitions. This is why everyone's in favor of it. I can find definitions I favor. They're good internet norms. I will say, there's consensus on one thing, and that is net neutrality means ISPs cannot block content online or filter the internet. And on this, the open internet order allows filtering by ISPs online. It expressly allows this. This came out in the court hearings. And so the open internet order doesn't regulate ISPs per se. It regulates bias provision, broadband internet access provision, which was invented in 2015 by the FCC. Once you don't provide bias, you're not regulated by Title II anymore. And so basically, ISPs can opt out if they don't provide bias. This came out in the court hearings. This comes out in the Open Internet Order, if you read it closely. If you filter the internet, you are no longer under Title II regulation. So the FCC essentially dares ISPs to filter the internet and escape regulation, or continue providing the service that everyone wants, which is kind of an unfiltered internet experience. So the Open Internet Order is not net neutrality. It allows ISPs to filter and to curate the internet. The court, the judge who upheld the rules said, no party disputes, ISPs can filter. So it's not net neutrality, even if you could define it. And so that's why I like what the chairman is proposing, which is to reclassify it as an information service, broadband access provision. What else? So yeah, I think Congress should be very attentive to this. Congress was not silent about internet regulation and internet access regulation. Section 230 in the Telecom Act says expressly that it's the policy of the United States. This was signed by Bill Clinton, from Republican Congress. It's the policy of the United States that the internet and specifically internet access should be unfettered by federal and state regulation. So, and that was what the law was for 20 years, and in 2015 that changed. And there's, I'll wrap up. There's this talking point that the Clinton administration regulated the internet and internet access, and that's just not the case. What the Clinton administration did when DSL came on the scene, they said when someone is using the internet, they're using two services. They're using a transmission path, which the Clinton administration said is a Title II service, and they're using internet access, which is an unregulated service. So they never regulated internet access. They regulated the transmission path. And if that's confusing, well, it is very confusing. And a few years later, the Republican FCC said, this doesn't make sense. Consumers don't see it this way. Internet access is a single service, and it's unregulated. That changed in 2015. That was the first time the FCC regulated internet access. So, and with that, I'll turn it over to Ryan.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Kent, and to Brent and Jeff for joining us, and to Chairman Pai for his excellent remarks. So let's say that this effort succeeds, that the FCC votes this Thursday to approve the notice of proposed rulemaking to undo the 2015 Title II order. And then sometime this fall or this winter, the FCC ultimately votes to issue a new rule undoing that 2015 Title II order. In other words, putting internet service providers back into the classification that they were under for many years. Does that end the debate? Can we stop all worrying about net neutrality and Title II and internet regulation? Unfortunately, despite how tired many of us are of the issues, the answer to that is no. And that goes back to to many things, but one notable decision was the Supreme Court saying in 2005 that the applicability of Title II of the Communications Act to internet service providers is ambiguous as a matter of law. Now, of course, as many of you know, if a statute that Congress passes is ambiguous and it's administered by an agency, under the Chevron doctrine, that agency gets to decide what the statute means as long as it adopts a permissible construction, which in practice can mean a lot of constructions. So what the FCC did back then was actually, and what was upheld by the Supreme Court was finding, after many years of analysis, that internet service providers should not be subject to these mandates. In part clarified by Congress saying in 1996, by adding Section 230, the internet should remain unfettered by state or federal regulation. But then the Title II order came along in 2015, and that was upheld by a panel of the D.C. Circuit 2-1. It could go to the Supreme Court hypothetically, but it seems unlikely because of what the FCC is doing now, which may moot that process. So ultimately, a future FCC under different leadership, which one can certainly envision in 4 or 8 or however many years, could restart this battle all over again. We could go back to the courts, and it would mean, in other words, a lot of uncertainty for internet service providers who are considering experimenting with business models that might be foreclosed by the Title II approach if the decision that the FCC will hopefully make later this year is undone. So that leaves Congress with an important role to play, saying essentially, we really mean it this time that the internet should remain unregulated, which it said again in 1996. Ideally, and Brent pointed this out, we need a statute that makes clear the FCC is not an internet regulator. The idea that this agency that was created in the old Ma Bell era in 1934 receives a clear and unambiguous grant of power from Congress to regulate the internet in any aspect should be troubling to those of us who care about free markets and internet freedom. And the idea that we need a specialized internet regulator in Washington, to me, is mistaken. Whatever you think about the FCC's roles in broadcast or telephone or legacy services, going forward, the institutions that address conduct by internet service providers, whatever they may be, they should not include the FCC. And that's something that we simply cannot achieve with security until Congress acts. And so that could mean the Federal Trade Commission, for example, receives authority, which is an interesting, complex legal question that is currently being sorted out in the Ninth Circuit over whether common carriers that offer telephone and internet service can be regulated. Now, that should soon be resolved, hopefully, because actually last week the court granted a hearing on Bonk. But without legislation, this issue will not be resolved. And what that legislation looks like, if it can ever pass, will be very important. A bipartisan, unanimous agreement would be great, but a compromise that shifts from the status quo, where the FCC has ambiguous authority that it can assert over the internet, versus a reality where it's clear that the FCC does have authority, would be a shift, to me, in the wrong direction. Rather, what we need is something emphasizing what Section 230 already pointed out, that the FCC does not have the power to regulate the internet, and the job on that falls to Congress to pass legislation.
So one of the things I've heard consistently now for 45 minutes is the paramount importance of what happens on Capitol Hill. And I think everyone appreciates the difficulty of making anything happen on Capitol Hill. At least two of you directly addressed the role of an updated statute. In your mind, if you were sitting in one of these seats and advising a senator, is the likely path forward a 2 to 3 page bill that simply clarifies the question that Ryan outlined? Or is it a comprehensive approach to the the underlying statute and taking on a raft of issues, which might lend itself to bringing in more coalition partners who could support more senators from different points of view who could support different aspects of the bill? What would be your counsel on a path forward?
Whatever works.
Whatever works.
Well, I mean, look, there's more opportunities for compromise and coalition building. If you have a bigger and more expansive bill, there's also a lot more opportunity for mischief, and it becomes, I mean, an entire rewrite of the Telecom Act, Communications Act, would be very welcome to most of us. It's obviously the 34 Act is outdated, but so is the 96 Act. But that strikes me as something that we probably shouldn't wish for, because the chances that it actually ends up being worse are pretty substantial. That's not to say that I wouldn't welcome it, but I would be very nervous about it. So I suppose my preference would be for a more targeted sort of approach, and I think that's a lot more likely to be made palatable. There are probably more opportunities to find agreement on a narrower set of issues. And contrary to what Ryan said, I would put the ordering, my preference would be legislation that makes clear the FCC does not have authority. My second preference would be legislation that makes clear the FCC does have authority, but appropriately circumscribes it. I think, I mean, Ryan's right that there's probably wasn't what was intended in the 96 Act, almost certainly clearly wasn't intended in the 96 Act. And again, there are potential pitfalls, but appropriately circumscribed, I think it's certainly better than the status quo. And I have to think that that's possible in the abstract, but of course, whether as a purely political matter it actually can happen, that's a lot harder. Hope so.
Other views?
So, as I suggested, I'm pretty satisfied with the current law, Section 230. But certainly, I mean, I think it's a sorry state of the law if an agency can overreach. Let me put it this way. So I've asked, what If Section 230 doesn't stop the FCC from Title II regulation of the internet, what combination of words could Congress put together that would stop the agency from doing it? And Section 230 is pretty clear. I mean, they were not silent about the state of the internet. They were silent about cable regulation in the 34 Act, and the FCC started regulating cable because they had no statute, and they said this affects broadcast. Congress didn't want that to happen again. It took them 20 years to repeal a lot of the FCC cable regulations. So Section 230 is pretty good, but if courts permit this, which would be unfortunate, Congress should weigh in again, and my preference would be, there'd be some net neutrality norms, and it would be enforced by the Federal Trade Commission under competition standards.
So it's always difficult to do reform, especially when it's comprehensive. There was an effort a few years ago by then-Senator DeMint and Representative Scalise to address just one chunk of what the FCC regulates, the video marketplace. So they introduced the Next Generation Television Marketplace Act, which was a thoughtful and comprehensive revision to how the FCC regulated in a pro-market way. Brent wrote in some nice things about that, and so did I, but that ended up not going anywhere. So perhaps here the right answer is narrower legislation. And I would also add that around Brent's point about the Federal Trade Commission, it's worth noting that one of the most notable examples of an alleged net neutrality violation was when Comcast was degrading BitTorrent uploading back in 2007. Initially, Comcast denied what it was doing. It then admitted it, and it then ended the practice voluntarily before the FCC even voted to initiate an enforcement action. Now that's an example of something where even existing law, the Unfairness and Deceptive Acts Practice prohibition in the FTC Act, would have allowed that agency to intervene without new authority. So when an internet provider holds itself out as offering internet access, there is ample authority already, to the extent that it's not a common carrier under Title II, to regulate that entity's behavior by not only the FTC, but also by state attorneys general, by individuals through arbitration or litigation, and so forth.
Sorry, just really quickly, that is a really important point to note in terms of what happens at the FCC if and when they do repeal, or whatever the correct word is. We're all still debating this, right? What is it that the FCC does with an existing rule? Rescind, repeal, replace. Anyways, one of the three R's. If and when they do that, to Ryan's point, we're not left with no authority whatsoever. We're not left with a Wild West in which there's no cop on the beat. In fact, the FTC, the state's attorneys general, the DOJ, private litigants, all of them would still have the ability to police conduct should problems arise. I think that's one of the important misunderstandings, and this is especially true after the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit took the AT&T case on appeal, vacated the lower court decision, which threw this into some question, at least in the Ninth Circuit. So for now, there's absolutely a cop on the beat, and every reason to think that they would be perfectly competent in doing what they're doing.
Well, I'm looking for questions from the floor. We have about 10 minutes left. As I seek one out, why don't we start at the other end of the table? And I'd invite you each, by analogy, help us understand someone that's doing the core constituent work. Help us understand what is meant in the strict legal sense and the way that these terms are bandied about in NPRMs and other orders and en banc hearings. Things like discrimination and prioritization. What do those mean for people that speak English and talk to regular Americans outside of Washington, D.C.? So
there's lots of information that's being transmitted over the internet. It's broken up into packets, and the question is what order they go in. The default mechanism is they go in sequential order. Sometimes if one drops, it's repeated. So they're being connected. They flow through these routers all across the country and the world, generally on a best effort basis, where if too many pieces of information are fitting through a pipe that can't fit, information is discarded. But that's not the way that the internet today always works, or that it has to always work. We have nowadays a lot of interesting arrangements to get data from wherever it starts to you. For example, Netflix actually uses its own private dark fiber lines along with content delivery networks and what's known as edge caching, where they don't have the data up in the cloud. They actually put much of their information on servers within each internet service provider to make it easier and cheaper to get to you. So when we talk about discrimination and prioritization, we're basically talking about how do we make decisions facing scarcity in networks about how information is transmitted and in what order. And the question really is, should those decisions be made up by internet providers working with or subject to competitive pressures from their rivals and from the companies that supply the information and the content and services that we are ultimately trying to get at through our internet service provider? Should those decisions be made on a voluntary decentralized basis, or should the FCC or some federal regulatory body or Congress dictate the process by which those decisions are made? And to us, I think, or at least to me, that's a better decision to be left to individual ISPs subject to the many pressures that they are under.
And Brent, what's the case for prioritization?
There are lots of things that maybe you'd want to prioritize. Not all traffic needs to get from point A to point B as quickly as others. Like if you're talking about real-time video conferencing, a second delay might make it unusable. Whereas if you're downloading a large file, adding an extra minute might not be noticeable. So there's in the future we could have things like telemedicine over the internet, or weird cool technologies like holograms that look like real people, and who knows what's going to happen in the future that we might want to have with prioritization. And the question is going to be, do we have a market that's flexible enough to let all these neat things happen, or will it be foreclosed by regulation?
I'll add to that, as Ryan suggested. So there's this talking point out there, a net neutrality talking point, that ISPs need to treat all bits the same. And when you talk to network engineers, they would say that would set the industry back 20 years. There's been priority built into networks for decades. The LTE standard has 8 levels of priority based on what the application is. As user demands get more heterogeneous, you want ISPs to be able to prioritize, say, a voice call over a once-a-day data backup. I mean, that's an easy one. But you're going to constantly, network operators need to prioritize certain applications over others. This will only grow as more services go online. And the question is this part of the market, or is this regulated and overseen and need FCC approval? And I'll add on the BitTorrent Comcast case. I mean, this is totally misrepresented in popular news media. So there, Comcast and BitTorrent did what you would expect in a fast-moving, dynamic industry. They sat down as engineers. So BitTorrent, at the time, used a lot of capacity. So cable is a shared resource. So if someone was using BitTorrent, it would use their neighbor's bandwidth as well. So Comcast and BitTorrent sat down. They figured out a solution. BitTorrent worked for 2 years on a protocol that self-throttled its own application. So it was a polite player on the internet. So that's what you want to happen. It was activists who invited the FCC to get involved, not BitTorrent. They figured it out themselves.
If I can just amplify that really quickly, that's a really important point here, that the prescribed rules under the Open Internet Order, the neutrality that is sort of mandated, takes away, I wouldn't say all, but the vast majority of the incentive on the part of non-ISPs to work in the way BitTorrent did, in the way other edge providers sometimes have, to try to relieve the congestion and the various problems of excess usage on the internet, because they have no incentive to do so in a world in which there's no way for them to realize any return on that. Now, they do eventually have some incentive if there's so much congestion that even though everyone's being treated equally, their services are being degraded enough that it's a problem for them, and that's presumably why we've seen Netflix, among others, invest actually in a fair amount of technology to try to mitigate their demands on the network. But this would work a lot more effectively if the providers, the content providers and the edge providers had more of an incentive to engage in that. I think Brent said this, we don't want maximum content on the internet. We don't want maximum speed. We want optimal content. We want optimal speed. And optimal is rarely maximum. Nobody likes to hear that, but that's actually true if you have a scarce resource, and every resource is in fact scarce. And so we need some way to optimize. And I think the Open Internet Order sort of forgets that there are lots of ways to optimize and assumes that the ISPs should bear that entire burden and assumes that that won't have negative effects on the functioning of the internet and actually their own incentives to invest.
My scarcest resource at the moment is time. In order to be a good neighbor, we have a hard stop on this room. And before I ask for any closing comments, do we have any questions from the floor? Okay, wonderful. I think that means you're all going to be hit up in the hallway. We do have about 3 or 4 minutes. If there's any point that you want to make sure that people hear, I invite you to make that now. And I invite everyone in our audience, both here with us and online, that there's opportunity to follow up and there's opportunity to keep learning about these issues. So Jeff's work at the International Center for Law and Economics, at Mercatus with Brent, and at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, each of them provides valuable resources. I know each of these individuals is available to you and to your colleagues to help sort through these issues, which are anything but simple and straightforward. So one more time through the table, why don't we take a minute or two and closing comments. Jeff, go ahead.
I don't get any Twitters to...
No Twitters, no speed round.
Okay, if I could add one other thing, I suppose it would be to recognize that there are non-neutralities built into all layers, all aspects, all throughout the internet ecosystem. The Open Internet Order deals with one of them, and perhaps not even the most important one. And by putting a thumb on the scale, it makes correspondingly more powerful or more important other, I hate this word, but gatekeepers, choke points on the internet. The BitTorrent story actually is a good example of this. ISPs might be able to rebalance the kind of bargaining positions of content providers and edge platforms that use content. If they're not able to do that, the power of the edge providers that in their bargaining and their relationships with content owners becomes correspondingly more powerful. That may not be, that may be a fine thing, but it may not be a fine thing. And it's completely absent from the consideration of the Open Internet Order. It's a really big, complex ecosystem.
So, as I suggested, I think Section 230 is a great law. I hope the chairman will restore that vision for the internet that we had for 20 years, or the Supreme Court. And if need be, if Congress does get involved, I would hope it would stay at the FTC with economics, with the Economics Bureau working on these issues, and not at the FCC, which is a media regulator at its core. And I don't want the FCC anywhere near the internet and its content. It's not been a friend of free speech in the past. And I'll just note, the Clinton administration had a great draft document in 1999 about the future of the FCC, where they saw a diminishing role for the agency as phone and cable became more competitive, as things became internet delivered. And in 2015, that was reversed. I mean, it's a totally different view of the world, where the FCC, as I said, is kind of reinvented as an internet regulator, as cable and broadcast and these other technologies either go on the wayside or reinvent themselves with the internet, and hopefully Congress and the courts won't let that happen.
Those of you with a legal bent, just to pick up on something that was mentioned, for a tour de force, I strongly encourage you to pick up a copy of the dissent in the recent en banc review by Judge Janice Rogers-Brown on these questions that Brent was just talking about. It's extremely thoughtful and powerful legal analysis of the questions he was just summarizing. And Ryan, you have the last word for us.
There's a positive agenda to talk about here beyond Title II and net neutrality, and that's the work the FCC is doing to make broadband deployment expand. Liberalizing spectrum, we just had the incentive auction close, and the FCC has also launched a broadband deployment advisory committee to look at things like eliminating governmental barriers to deploying broadband. And Brent Skorup here is one of the leaders, the vice chair. And Jeff, we have two panelists here that are on that committee that will help advise the FCC on how to make broadband more competitive, which will hopefully make those who insist on regulation realize that there's a story about competition that's a better one to tell than governmental intervention.
And on a positive note, right?
Thank you.